Hey, everybody. Welcome again to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today, it's a pleasure to have on Andrew Bustamante, and he's the creator of EveryDay Espionage, a podcast, and also the YouTube channel EveryDay Spy and the website. So thank you so much for coming on, Andre.
Yeah, absolutely, man. It's my pleasure to be here.
Andrew, I'm sorry.
It's all good, man. It's all good.
Yeah. So, I really enjoy your podcast. I listen to it. I watch your YouTube channel. I really appreciate the perspective that you bring in talking about intelligence and kind of like everyday life and how, some of the applications of intelligence are applicable in kind of everyday life. So, just for the listening audience, what is your podcast and who are you?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Andrew Bustamante. I'm an ex-CIA covert intelligence officer. I am now the founder of the digital platform EveryDay Spy, everydayspy.com. And my passion, man, is just to take all of the training, all of the experience that I learned working undercover for CIA and bring it to people in the open so that they can live a safer, more productive, more optimized life, because that's been what's the most powerful to me. My time at CIA was awesome, but what's really been powerful is how the training that I received has helped me in every other aspect of life. Because now that I'm out of CIA, I'm running my own business. I'm creating my own contacts. I'm negotiating my own contracts. I'm building my own wealth, building my own legacy. And my CIA training has never been more valuable to me than it is right now. And that's something everybody can relate to, but only a small elite few of us ever get the training. So it's my passion, my joy to bring that training to everyday people with EveryDay Spy. And of course, with my podcast, the EveryDay Espionage podcast. So thank you very much for being a listener, brother.
Yeah, man. And again, anybody who's listening, definitely check out Andrew's work, his podcast, his YouTube channel, website. There's a lot of really cool things here. And, and again, so this is somewhat of a UFO podcast. And I think that, these kind of ideas of intelligence are in the UFO subject, they get brought up a lot, but I think there's a lot of application here on perception versus perspective and things like that you discuss on your podcast. So
yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you saw it, James, but I recently had a private intelligence contract, a private client who funded a deep dive intelligence review of all UFO information released by CIA and released internationally. So I just closed a contract on this. This is like a multi-million-dollar client because the question of UFOs, the question of UAPs and what's in the sky and what's the safety impact and how does that impact our national security? How does it impact our stock market? How does it impact the future technologies that are going to be released and disruptive in industry? These are massive questions with very relevant curiosity and interest. And you can actually find my report on everydayspy.com/UFO. So James, if you haven't seen it, or if anybody watching this wants that, I'm sure we can plug it into the contact notes below too. But everydayspy.com/UFO, the client agreed to let everybody have access to his funded report, which I think is super awesome.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. I took a quick look over it. I didn't attend I think you had a Zoom event or a YouTube event. I didn't get to see that. But I'm interested about hearing about it. I do want to get back into that your report and stuff. That's a little later on. I want to discuss like some of your findings and stuff like that. And it'll be in the description notes as well. But before all the recent UFO hype in the media, had you ever really looked into UFOs or heard about them in a significant way, or was it kind of just a subject in the passing?
No, actually, so when I was with the U.S. Air Force, I was a missile commander in Montana at Malmstrom Air Force Base. And in 2006, I think it was 2006, I had a very strange phenomenon occur when I was in command of my missile base. And I actually documented, reported everything up through military channels and received a very curt military answer that basically said, okay, you've reported it, now it's over, right? Don't talk about it. It's done. It's been moved into other channels. Moved into other channels usually means it's been classified. So when I was told that was the end of my, military observance or whatever. And that that experience was one where we had multiple sensors that were triggered in a 200 square mile missile field, but triggered in rapid succession, and it was unexplainable. There was no easily terrestrial explanation for how these auditory vibrational sensors could have been triggered in rapid succession in the same row in a sequence like they were. That same experience actually ended up coming to light on a Discovery Channel UFO series called Contact in 2019. So I myself have had strange, unexplained experiences that have kind of sensitized me to the UFO community. But even still, I have always leaned on rational thinking, objective information, and logic when I try to come to my own conclusions. So yeah. I think that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I'm familiar. No, I don't laugh it off. I take UFOs and UAPs extremely seriously, but I do it from a logic-based, objective reality kind of point of view rather than a conspiratorial or fictional point of view.
Right. Yeah. And I appreciate that. Because again, we have, this kind of UFO subject. It's, over the past 70, 80 years, there are a lot of conspiracies, but at the same time, there's a possible cover-up, and I don't say cover-up in a conspiratorial way. Obviously, if there are such objects as UFOs, there's going to be national security involved.
Exactly, and I would change. So I try to apply the right terminology. Cover-up is not the right terminology, just like you said, right? It's not the stereotypical cover-up. This is if it's a national, if UAPs are in fact extraterrestrial or terrestrial from a hostile threat, there is a national security impetus to make sure that information stays contained, and that would require a full-scale classification, a management of secret information, a large-scale cleanse that would keep the truth out of media, keep the truth away from the everyday person. That would keep the truth away from people in Congress and people in the highest levels of government that don't have need to know. That's just good national security practice. That is classification. It is not a cover-up. Right.
So you kind of define it as a national security priority then.
Absolutely. Just think about it, man. I mean, we all agree with it. What's amazing to me is that what we're seeing now is that Congress is doing what it's supposed to do. Congress is saying, here is a massive issue. It's either at a bare minimum, it's an issue related to the safe operations in the air, commercial airlines, civil aviators, whatever it might be. There's a risk to air travel posed by these unexplained aerial phenomenon. So Congress is doing the right thing. They're just doing it 70 years too late, right?
Right. Yeah, and
they should be the ones to lead that kind of conversation.
Right. And you had Senator Harry Reid. He actually was the one who helped found the ATP program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And some of their concerns even then were, well, if you have these strange incidents, you have objects that are coming in that are able to neutralize, nuclear armaments and ICBMs. And, I guess in the classified world, back some years ago, one of their concerns was, if they have the ability, whatever, whoever's behind the phenomenon is able to neutralize something like that. If we were in a dire situation, those armaments would have been disabled. So that does sound like a high priority. But so getting back to like the kind of current media environment regarding UFOs, and now they've more frequently called it UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. Had you ever heard of people like Luis Elizondo prior to him coming out publicly stating that he was the director of this program?
There's a lot of names that I think are popular. There are names that are known inside those classified circles, but the expertise isn't something that we share openly. There's a lot of need to know that obfuscates who knows what, right? So, but when you see someone like Luis come out and go mainstream with his credentials and with his background and with his with the way he speaks, it makes sense that he would be taken as a credible authority. And it makes sense that if he's going to say he has the access that he had, then there's no reason to immediately deny that he had that access. But one thing that I will say is that in my experience, most of the people who were in charge of really sensitive, really classified operations, myself included, we sign a lifetime secrecy agreement that we don't talk about our own operational background. That's the thing that people don't understand is the vast majority of experts out there, all those CIA memoirs and all of your intelligence experts out there, if they're actually talking about their own background, that has been cleared by the federal government. If it's not cleared by the federal government, they essentially go to jail. That is the breaking of a secrecy agreement. So when someone says, I did this for this program, and now I'm speaking about it, it's either not true or it's been granted approval by the federal government, right? So you can take that however you choose to take it. Some people say, well, if it's been approved by the government, then it's not really a secret. That's actually, that's irrelevant. The point is he's either speaking factually about something he was involved in, or he's applying his expertise into something that he was not directly involved in the past. But in both ways, there's a credible authority there that can lend to the conversation.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting. What's going on now is because there was a public spokesperson for the Pentagon who was saying that they've changed their stance on Luis Elizondo and the ATP program 3 or 4 times over the years. It's been kind of like a fiasco. First, they said they didn't look into UAP. Then they said they kind of did, but not exclusively. And there's just been this kind of dance. And now that the Inspector General's involved in an evaluation of Luis Elizondo and some of his claims. So that's a pretty interesting turn of events. But obviously, we know now that we have the UAP report. So at least some of what he was saying is kind of, in a sense, vetted by, that this report was produced by UAP task force.
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting to me is that what you see here, that dance that you were just talking about, that is a very classic dance of a secret program slowly being released. Nobody knows exactly what they can and can't say. Nobody knows what they can and can't acknowledge. And there's a stickiness to secret programs. And here's the stickiness. That they happened isn't that important to government. Government doesn't really care. It either did or it didn't happen. But the success of the program and the negative repercussions of the program are what make it sticky. Think about when we equipped the Mujahideen with anti-aircraft weapons that they could carry on their shoulders, right? That happened back when Russia and Afghanistan were an issue. That was a secret program. It's really sticky when that program comes to light because the same Stinger missiles are now being used by the Taliban to shoot down American aircraft in Afghanistan. That's what makes a program sticky. How do you roll that back? How do you talk about what was and wasn't happening, why it was approved, how much funding was used? That's a dance. And it's especially a dance for those people who have to speak publicly on behalf of the Pentagon or the CIA or the intelligence community or the White House. All of those public, I forget what they're called now, the people who are making the public announcements, the Office of Protocol or whatever. So that's exactly what you're seeing here. How much do we say? Did the ATP exist? Was it well funded? Why did we make all these mistakes if it was well funded, if it existed? So it's this awkward dance of, maybe I did screw up, or we were doing it, but we didn't take it seriously. And that's really what I got out of that DNI final report, was that the Navy started looking at it seriously, and the Air Force didn't even bother looking at it seriously. They just carbon copied the Navy's program. And I mean, even the report itself acknowledged that it wasn't going to look at information older than 3 years because all of the information collected prior to that wasn't properly sourced, vetted, or recorded. So that means like 67 years of history have been lost because our government wasn't being professional with the information. That's just silly, right? And even more silly is to try to tell Congress, here's the conclusions that we've made off of just the last 3 years, mainly from reporting that only came from two military services. It's just silly to me. That's not professional in any way.
Yeah. Well, and now, people like Christopher Mellon, He worked in, I think he was the assistant deputy for intelligence for the senator. He had some kind of big title like that, and he looked over at special access programs. And part of what he is saying is like, okay, we should be looking at, we have satellite data and all these different platforms that are already collecting data that we can look at. And I think that's something that they are trying to kind of push the UAP task force to be able to, number one, get access to, and then you have to collect the intelligence and then analyze it. And again, that's a whole process within itself, because some of those systems are classified, and now they have to be granted access, and that that it's going to take at least 6 months, and they had just 6 months to put that report together.
Correct. And the main conclusion of the report is that they need more funding. And this is another dance. And this is what makes me so frustrated about the way the US government works. The Congress says, military, you're responsible for this. DNI, intelligence community, you are responsible for our national security. Tell us what's happening. Give us a threat assessment. And then the threat assessment comes in and it says, well, we don't have a lot of information because we need more money. So now we're going to kick the ball back to you, right? Now, you've got to give us more money if you want better information. Meanwhile, Congress is stuck there saying, well, what have you been doing? And money aside, if it is the first U.S. military service to take this seriously and create a program was the U.S. Navy. They didn't ask for extra money. They made it a risk of flight priority. They created a program to record and document strange and unidentified aerial phenomenon. And then they created a program and sensitized it to their pilots. That is the way it's supposed to work. So it's ridiculous to me to see the DNI coming out and saying, well, we need more money if you want this to be better, when we've got proof in the pudding that you don't actually need more money, that you could just do this right now. Can Congress award them more money? For sure, Congress can award them more money, but that shouldn't be a showstopper. That shouldn't be something that stops the investigation. And when you read that first preliminary report, it sounds like, from the point of view of the IC at least, that we've done this, we've done our 7 pages of research, and here's our boring non-committal report. And until you give us more money, we're not going to take it seriously. We're going to wait for the next president 4 years down the road, or we're going to wait for the next congressional vote to change out who's in Congress. It's such a government dance to just wait for the electoral cycle to basically wash out any of the Congress people or change the issues of the day so that people stop caring and stop worrying. Yeah.
And again, you see this kind of interesting rollout in the mainstream media and how people are taking it. There was a classified report that was a bit longer, and there's a whole debate on that now, whether the classified report was 70 plus pages, as some people have indicated. And then some people are saying, oh, the classified report was only 17 pages. And there's people saying, oh, well, there was actually 70 pages. And then the 17 pages were the executive report summary that was given to them in the classified brief. So there was some kind of classified version of that. The Senate Intelligence Committee, at least, and the FBI were able to get briefed on. And, after that meeting, you had Representative Andre Carson come out, and he was saying, oh, we should have classified hearings first, and then a public hearings on the subject. Do you think that's something that's likely to happen?
No, not at all. Because here's the thing. The fact that there's a classified version of the report suggests that there is national security information in the report. If it's not related to national security, it shouldn't be classified, right? Just look at the definitions of classification, from confidential to secret to top secret. Every one of them has to do with the level of impact to national security. So the fact that there is an impact to national security enough to drive any kind of classified report suggests that there is some information out there that is not appropriate for public consumption. And I know that pisses people off. I know people in the public think they should be allowed to listen and understand everything, but just just imagine your neighbor. How much of what happens in your daily life isn't your neighbor's business? Not necessarily because your neighbor just doesn't deserve to know or doesn't have the right to know, or because you're exercising some sort of sovereign freedom over your neighbor, but because your neighbor wouldn't understand, right? Maybe you're vegan and your neighbor eats meat and they just don't get it, right? Or maybe you eat meat and your neighbor's vegan and they just don't get it. But they're gonna pitch a fit. They're gonna cause all sorts of issues in the relationship between you and your neighbors if they know this piece of information that you have chosen to keep private. Essentially, that's the same thing that classification is supposed to do in the realm of national security. It doesn't do the public any good to know the same level of fragmented, incomplete information that pertains to national security, because they don't have the context, the training, and the other information required to come to a meaningful conclusion. But the people that they have elected into office and the tax base that they have created to train and to fund training and experiences for their military and for their CIA, FBI, DIA, NSA, you have to trust the professionals to do what the professionals know how to do because they understand it better. So when I hear that there's a classified report, that tells me, okay, there is national security impetus here. There is something going on. And for all we know, that classified report really is just a report that spends 17 or 70 pages saying, we haven't done a very good job taking this seriously. And now we need to change it because here's what we're seeing, whether it's extraterrestrial threats or terrestrial threats, right? Here's a reason for us to classify this, not make it known to the public, and share this with you, Senate hearing, or Senate Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, I think some of the ideas that, oh, well, there's been such a stigma on the entire topic that kind of everything was thrown into kind of classified information. And now what they want to do is analyze and say, okay, what doesn't really doesn't need to be classified, and what actually is of national security importance. So I think that's one of the concerns.
For sure.
But you were, I guess you still are in some regards in the intelligence community. How are people in the intelligence community kind of reacting to this? What's the pulse on that?
Yeah, there's two kind of important things at play in the intelligence community, right? The first you mentioned briefly in passing was the stigma. There has always been a stigma in government, among government professionals, national security professionals. There's always been a stigma against UFOs. Someone who claims that they've seen a UFO or someone who believes in UFOs is kind of immediately judged in that community as being non-professional, right? They're amateur, they're conspiratorial, right? They're judged as less than professional. So because of that, that's why we've seen people just not report incidents. We've seen people have something occur that's suspicious, and maybe they report it, but they don't report it completely. They don't report it in detail. They report it in kind of in circumstances or with non-descriptive use of language, something that tries to protect their own career, because they know if they come out and say, I saw 3 lights in the sky that were unidentified and they were hovering and not making a noise. If they describe something like that, then their supervisor is not only going to squash the report, but also they're going to get sent on a one-way ticket to, an empty base in Alaska or something. So that stigma is very real because it has in the fact, and it can always affect someone's career in the military, in the government, anywhere. So the stigma is a big factor that has driven the IC's reaction. Now that it's more public, the question is, well, is the stigma wrong? Am I allowed to come out and talk about my UFO experience? Am I allowed to talk about my opinions about UFOs and still be deemed a professional intelligence officer or a professional law enforcement officer? So that stigma is kind of one big factor. And then the other big factor is that people in the IC know how the IC works. The whole reason we're having this conversation isn't because I've had any one-on-one experience with any kind of secret alien base or secret alien program or some kind of secret anything that has to do with hiding UFOs. The reason we're talking, James, is because I understand how the intelligence community works. And it's an extremely predictable process. The whole process of intelligence collection, analysis, and final intelligence production is extremely predictable. And the fact that this has become an issue that's in the mainstream, funded by Congress, with public challenges going as high as the White House, in the world of intelligence, that means there is a national security threat related to UAPs, and someone needs to fix it. That's all it means, that's light years above where we were 15 years ago.
Right. Even, yeah. So, a lot of this was coming out in 2017 after, the New York Times breaks the story and Lou Elizondo essentially comes out and says that, he was involved in the ATP program. Which kind of leads to the next point. You mentioned before when we were talking, the government really hasn't taken a stance on this. So people have argued, and in one sense, the Pentagon is kind of gaslighting people, like to have these conspiracies where they're coming out and, different people within the government. Obviously, we know the government is just a collection of people like me, you, and whoever else is out there. They have their duties and their jobs. There's people in the government, and they say, UAP are real, and we don't know what they are, and because they haven't provided a solution or answer, people are assuming that they have to come to their own conclusions in a sense. So what do you make of like the idea of how can people make sense of what's going on, number one, and number two, if the government, United States government in this case, is coming out and saying, these things are real and we don't know what they are, people have kind of like a trust issue, especially within the UFO community, because of the years of secrecy and things like that, and people are kind of driven to basically, write their own narratives in a sense, and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah. So again, a great question with two parts, right? So the first thing I would say is that to answer your first question, how do people make sense of what's going on? The tool that we're taught in intelligence to make sense of confusing or compounding information is is to understand Occam's razor. Have you heard of Occam's razor?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Simplest solution. Yeah.
Yeah. The simplest explanation is most likely to be true. And in intelligence, we work in a world of probabilities.
Yeah.
So let's go back to what you just said, right? The government is really just a collection of people, like you, like me, like everybody else. If anybody has ever been to the DMV, if anybody has ever called a customer service helpline for state or federal government, right? If anyone's ever had something go wrong when they were trying to apply for passports or unemployment or a marriage certificate from the state, you name it, we all know the government has plenty of incompetent people because they're just everyday people. Everybody who works at CIA or FBI or NSA or the UAP task force, guess what? They all have kids. They all have spouses. They all have moms and dads, right? They're all just everyday people trying to hash their way through on a government salary. So what matters to us doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is their career. Did they log in on time? Did they log off on time? Did their boss see that last email, right? Is their leave approved? That kind of stuff, right? Who's going to reimburse them for their child care credit this week? That's the kind of stuff that goes through their head, not because they're lazy, but just because they're everyday people. So you have only a small fraction of people in government who are extremely high performers, just like you only have a small fraction of people at your job, or a small fraction of people in your work, or a small fraction of people in whatever community you run in who are truly highly dedicated high performers. Everybody else is just average or below average. So that's the team that makes up everyone who's looking into the UAP phenomenon, right? That's the team. A few high performers, a lot of average, and a handful of below average, all of which have competing priorities with their own real everyday life that make the whole question of UAPs and whether or not some piece of analysis gets read or whether it gets stuck on the bottom of a shelf. That's the kind of stuff that happens when people are just people. So if you want to make sense of what's happening, Occam's razor. What's the simplest solution? Simplest solution is that somebody didn't really do a good job. Somebody overlooked something. Something wasn't funded well enough. Someone didn't understand what they were looking at, so they ignored it. They kicked the ball down for the next manager, right? That's the simplest solution. So why is there so much that we don't know? Because somebody was probably lazy, or a handful of people were probably lazy. The same reason that your marriage certificate took too long, or that you had to go home the third time you went to the DMV, because there's still some piece of paperwork missing, right? That's the first the answer to your first question. How do you make sense of it all? That way. Now, the second part of your question had to do with, if the government is so interested now, what does that tell us, right? How do we read that? Because they're serious, but they're also talking about it. If they're talking about it, how serious can it really be, right? It seems like it's confusing. In the world of intelligence and the world of national security, there's a tool known as deterrent. And I don't know if you've ever heard of deterrence as an offensive tool, but the whole reason that we started creating nuclear weapons was to deter other countries from using nuclear weapons against us. So when we release public footage of our F-18s and our weapon systems tracking the Tic Tac at high speeds across the open ocean, what are we doing? We're sending a clear message that if any terrestrial person, hostile or friendly, commercial or otherwise, is creating this technology, guess what? Here's a video that proves we see it and we can track it. So that is a strong deterrent. Now let's just go with me on a hypothetical, right? Hypothetically, let's assume that one of these technologies was being developed by an adversarial country. And then in 2017 or 2007, when it was under development, we found it, we recorded it, we tracked it, and we kept it classified. So we tracked the progress of that technology for 10 years before we made it public knowledge, right? So it went from being a little tic-tac that flew across the ocean to now being a well-controlled machine that's automated, that can be reached with satellite bouncing, whatever you want to call it, right? Signal bouncing or signal hopping. Now we've been tracking it for 10 years. And then we get an intelligence report that says it's about to be used in some theater of war. Maybe it's Syria, maybe it's Yemen, maybe it's Afghanistan. Now all of a sudden it's in the US interests, the US national security best interest to leak some sort of film. Now it's in our best interest to say, well, let's feed this out through the UFO community because that community is international. And when the hostile adversary on the other side views the video that we recorded 13 years ago, they're going to put one and one together and be like, oh, wait a second. We thought this was a super classified, really secure program. And in fact, the US has been watching it since 2007. Maybe we shouldn't deploy this new technology into Yemen. Maybe we shouldn't use it in Syria. Maybe we should just keep it at home and keep developing it further. Maybe we should launch a counterintelligence campaign to understand just how much is actually known. That's the power of deterrence, right? It's what keeps people from launching new weapons all the time. It's something that happens whether it's the New York Times spilling the story about how we're collecting on Osama bin Laden's satellite phone, or whether it's, Wired magazine talking about disguises, there's always a utility in selectively releasing information on the part of the government into normal media channels. It's not disinformation or misinformation, it's factual information. But the purpose behind it is more than just public knowledge.
Right. So, getting to some of what you're talking about there, is that kind of your read on what's going on with the UAP subject being rolled out into the public?
Yeah, the way I'm seeing this is there's probabilities. There's a probability index that we use for all intelligence conclusions, right? Everything's run against a nexus of how probable is it and how impactful is it, right? So when something is highly probable and highly impactful, we take action. When something is improbable and highly impactful, we might take some action, but not too much. But when something is like not impactful and not probable, it gets left off the table. So I think that for like 60 years, we've been looking at UFOs saying, it's not very likely, it's not very impactful. Something changed in that XY chart to make it not just probable, but also impactful. To me, we live in a world where technologies are growing at an exponential rate. Commercial technology moves 10 times faster than government, right? You would be embarrassed if you knew what the operating system was for CIA's computers. We would all be humiliated if we knew what the operating system was for any government enterprise level system. Because when I worked in corporate world, the enterprise solution, the enterprise operating system was constantly under review and constantly being bid because there's a CIO who benefits from having the most cutting edge technology possible. The government works the exact opposite way. What's secure? Secure is always slow, secure is always old. So they have completely different points of view on that. So for me, what I think must have happened is that something in this arena threatened national security, moved the dial on the probability index, that also moved the dial on the impact index. So that means either some commercial company for the United States or some commercial company for a foreign adversary has created a technology that the US government caught on camera or some US military aircraft caught with a weapon system. And then that was tracked over time, and maybe it's continued to be developed, or maybe a sister or an offshoot was developed, but something happened where it's in our best interest, it's in the Navy's best interest to release classified, confidentially controlled footage from the weapon system of an F-18. How many other videos have you ever seen created using that electronic signature radar that's on an F-18 combat aircraft?
Right.
Not
right.
Right?
Just a
You
few.
go out there, you see a bunch of UFO footage from that one release and basically nothing else. That is an extremely controlled release, my friend. Maybe it wasn't run, maybe it was a genuine Navy leak, but the point is, there was a message someone was trying to send, and if we're fortunate, the right recipient got that message, and now we're all a little bit safer.
Yeah, and the story behind that is actually Christopher Mellon worked with Luis Elizondo, and they legally they went through their due diligence, they did DOPSR, and they went the extra mile to get the footage unclassified for public release. And it was coordinated with, I suppose, the release of the New York Times story that kind of blew the lid, I guess, on ATIP. And, kind of what you're saying is it's interesting how it came out and the impact it's caused. So it's, it went from, UFOs were silly, and now, almost every day we see a new UAP article. So if there was somebody that, thought they were pulling one over on us, it's like we have this entire database on them now.
Yeah.
But you mentioned before that you had a UAP report for your website. Can you discuss some of what was in there?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not for my website. It was for a private intelligence client. So
Okay.
The world that I live in now is private intelligence. And in private intelligence, there's plenty of hateful media out there, condemning and damning us former intelligence officers who now go into the private sector. But I was hired by a client to do a deep dive analysis of all UFO publicly available information and reach an intelligence-based conclusion about what that information tells us, where it's pointing us, and what it means for the future. And my client had more interests in terms of, investment and, personal security interest and that sort of stuff. And he was also very interested in UFOs. The highest echelons of people, the wealthiest, most educated, most successful people out there, they don't laugh about UFOs. They think of them as a very real possibility, because these are people who have already beaten the odds, right? When you meet somebody who's worth $100 million or more, when you meet someone who's like Jeff Bezos, who's worth an incredible amount of money, they don't limit the way they think to just what they see in front of them, because they're not waiting for a paycheck every 2 weeks. They have so much money, they don't even think about money, right? So their mind is free of all the stress that comes from money. The average person is trapped in this world where they're just trying to figure out, is $12 too much to pay for a burrito, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like what I think Joe Rogan says is FU money. They have the self funding mechanism basically to not be concerned about what they say and do, because they're not limited to worrying about what their boss is going to think, or, is this going to endanger my career?
For them. Exactly.
Right. Correct.
Just like we talked about, the stigma is one of the things that holds people back, and the stigma's gone. So that's why I was picked up to do a private intelligence contract on UFOs.
Yeah. And you had Robert Bigelow. He's, really into the issue. He was on 60 Minutes a few years ago, right before the New York Times story broke. And, it's funny, I guess coincidentally, right, that he was the guy who had the contract with the Pentagon. Was Robert Bigelow had the Pentagon contract for OSAP, which kind of morphed into ATIP. ATIP was kind of like a sister sub program within OSAP. But, and Robert Bigelow was here on 60 Minutes, and they say, what do you think about, ETs or whatever? And he says, he laughs. He's like, I don't give a damn. He's like, they're here. They're right under everybody's noses. And, that kind of was, he is a bit eccentric, but he was pretty straightforward to the point. But it's no secret that Robert Bigelow had been interested for the UFO subject and for many years. He funded abduction research in the 90s So I guess, he was forward and eccentric in that way, but it was interesting that he had the government contract for that. And, he's on 60 Minutes
Yeah, exactly.
talking
So,
about.
so you're seeing it, right? You're seeing that if you yourself or if one of your listeners is a UFO fan or a UFO eccentric or a ufologist, right? There's reason to be interested and curious, and people at the highest levels are interested and curious too. So that's kind of that's what drove my contract. But the focus for my report, the report that I have at everydayspy.com/UFO, focus for that report was on what can we demonstrably, mathematically prove? Where does the proof lead us? Right. And that took me in such a cool direction, because now I had to look at the probability for alien life and the probabilities for alien civilizations. And then I had to measure those against the probability that an alien civilization is superior to that civilization that we have here on Earth. And what I found here is that 98% of what you see publicly available on UFOs is limited in thinking by human psyche, because we've all been shaped by our own set of experiences. It's a cognitive bias that's called the availability heuristic. We've all been shaped by what we've seen, what we've experienced, and what we've learned. That includes what we've learned in school and what we've learned from like sci-fi shows, right? So the fact that people continue to think that there are little green men, or that there's some kind of alien life form that is in any way humanoid, that is a major flaw in thinking. To think that an alien life form would look anything like a human being is completely and totally improbable. The most foreign life forms that we've seen, that we found on Earth, happen at the depths of the ocean, or in supreme heat, or in the highest levels of our atmosphere, right? These super durable living creatures that have some kind of intelligence, but aren't as intelligent as a human being. That is the most probable explanation for what an extraterrestrial will look like. They will be highly durable. They will probably be very small, and they will have intelligence, but it will not be the same level of intelligence as a human being. So we have created this need for discovery and this need to travel and observe, and we've created science and we've created mathematics, but there's no reason for us to believe that an alien life form, an extraterrestrial being, has done the same thing. What we're really looking for is our own imaginary idea of what a humanoid would look like 10,000 light years away. We think that somewhere out there, some planet, some civilization that's superior to our own has created this need to discover our civilization. It's just a mirror image of what all of our stories and sci-fi hype tell us. We are on this trajectory to explore the universe. It's Star Trek, it's Star Wars played all over again in reverse. The numbers don't back it up. There's actual mathematical evidence that shows that the likelihood of any UAP, any unidentified aerial phenomenon, the chances of that being extraterrestrial in nature is 1 in 500 million. The odds are 1 in 500 million. Every other unknown phenomenon that you see in the sky is explainable terrestrially, whether it's atmospheric, whether it's a drone, whether it's a balloon that got lost by some little kid, right? It is explainable according to probabilities. But to me, in the world of intelligence, we don't care about the 99.9%. We want to understand that 0.01%. And the question behind UFOs, the real conclusion in my report, is that where everyday people stand on UFOs, the questions they are asking themselves are diametrically opposed to the questions that their government is asking themselves. And I found this out by doing research against US classified records, British classified records, French classified records, and all sorts of intel reports from all over the world, right? Russia, China, Argentina, Brazil. The questions that we're asking, the core driving factor, is totally different. We're trying to answer questions as human beings on a path for discovery. Our government is only trying to answer questions as it pertains to immediate threats right now. We're never going to see it eye to eye.
Yeah, for sure. And from there, I kind of have two questions. Well, first, I want to say, there's the idea of, UFOs equal extraterrestrial, which is, again, that's kind of like a subculture thing. But people like Jacques Vallée have proposed, what if it's something, I think he was quoted on Jeffrey Mishlove saying, if the UFO phenomenon turns out to be something like little green men, I'm going to be very disappointed. That all these phenomenon occur, and it's just, a biological alien life form is responsible for it, when it could be something much greater.
Yes.
And Jacques Vallée is kind of like a progressive thought mover in the movements from the 1960s. He worked with J. Allen Hynek, and really smart guy, but again, he kind of his approach is unconventional in that sense. And there's the idea of, what if it's a crypto or ultra terrestrial, somehow another kind of advanced life form that we don't really understand, right? In the way that we would say alien or whatever. And just on a personal note, I like that movie Arrival, even though it is a sci-fi. That had that octopoid. It kind of looked like a sea life form. But what would it, for you as Andrew Bustamante, everyday guy, intelligence background, what would it do for you if there was some kind of like disclosure and they said, yeah, it's a UFOs are controlled by some kind of non-human intelligence? How would what would that be like for you?
That would make me feel like I'm like in a science experiment. But
right.
Science isn't scary. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What I'm worried about, my health, my safety, my well-being, and the well-being of my family and my children. And it's there's an awesome psychological study out there, a theory that when Columbus sailed to the New World and he landed, that the Native Americans that were on land, who had never seen a ship that big, do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
That they were essentially blind to the ship being there at all.
Yeah.
And that's how Columbus was able to sail right up and just, make everybody sick and take over everybody's land. That's the kind of mind-bending reality that would actually happen if a biological, non-human life form came to our planet. Our brains would be bent. It's so far outside of anything that we could ever imagine, unless in the extremely unlikely possibility they come here looking like the aliens from Arrival, or they come here looking like something that already exists inside the United States, inside the world.
Yeah, or some. Would that be a shocker to you?
No, it wouldn't be a shocker to me, because, like, when you look at the preponderance of evidence, there's plenty of life forms bigger than human beings, right? There's biological non-human life forms bigger than us, whales, trees, right? Like aspen groves. There's plenty of stuff bigger than us. And there's stuff that's bigger than us that has intellect and the ability to communicate across large distances, right? Whether that's in the ocean, like a whale or a shark or whatever else, an orca. Like, there's plenty of life forms out there that already show us the preponderance of evidence that we're not the largest and we're not the only intelligent life form that's non-human. This one just happens to come from somewhere else. If there was irrefutable evidence, bring it on. That's cool. If you have irrefutable evidence that they're hovering at like 35,000 feet, observing us from an invisible observation post, that still doesn't make me worry. I'm still more afraid of a Chinese or Russian hack against my personal computer, right?
Right. And that's so funny, because that's kind of the position that Marco Rubio had, who was one of the chairs for the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was saying, I'm almost hoping it's something else, because if this is China or Russia that has the technologies that they're observing, and a lot of the information that's contained within the classified reports of some of the performance of this technology
we're doomed.
It's very gloom.
That's exactly right. And that's the message that I think there's another cognitive flaw in every human brain, where we don't want to face the most dangerous scenario. We avoid it to all extents possible. That's why, when people have lung cancer, they still smoke, right? It's why people who are extremely overweight still eat unhealthy food, because they're avoiding the most dangerous outcome and they think that if they just don't focus on it, it won't happen. That's exactly what we're seeing with a lot of UAP and UFO reporting. The most dangerous, the scariest outcome is that one of our adversaries has a technology that is so superior to anything we possess that we can't even explain it when we see it in English words. There might be a whole Chinese lexicon out there that can explain all those aerial phenomenon, but because they developed it. Or there might be a whole Russian lexicon that can explain it, or like an Arabic language, like a Farsi equivalent, because Iran created it. Who knows? That is infinitely scarier to me than any extraterrestrial being who chooses to come and observe us. Let them come. But please, if this is a foreign atmosphere, we need to step in and we need to do something.
Yeah. So what, I guess, kind of roundabout similar way, what do you think of the idea of disclosure, right? If just say, again, thought experiment, this is a non-human intelligence, whatever it is. What do you think that there would be an incentive for the government to disclose that information?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And here's why. Because if they disclose that information, then each individual who hears that information is given the freedom to interpret it however they choose. So you might interpret it as being interesting. Oh, wow, there's an alien, there's a non-human being out there, hovering 10,000 feet above me in an invisible aircraft watching me. I don't feel threatened. But
yeah,
some guy 10 miles down the road might be like, this is an invasion of my privacy and I need to take action. And then that guy's going to start shooting his guns at the guy to try to hit this invisible aircraft, which is going to be a mess for so many reasons. But that's the problem with widespread disclosure. It's honestly, it's the same problem that I have with voting. Does everybody have the right to vote? Absolutely. But is every voter equally informed about the candidate they're voting for? Not even close. Some people only read conspiratorial news. Some people read, information that's balanced and fair. Some people are highly educated. Some people are not. That's why widespread disclosure about UFOs is never going to work, because it's going to have the same effect. Some people will be highly informed. Some people will not. Some people will be conspiratorial. Some people will be fearful. And we'll have the same issue that leads to the hostile experience that we all have in the United States when it comes to politics and government. We'll have the exact same thing occur when it comes to extraterrestrial visitors. And that's not a very good first impression.
Right. And, that's actually one of the scariest things about today is the flow of information and how it could be influenced. Oddly enough, there was an old kind of conspiracy guy, and he proposed this idea about information wars, and this kind of way to influence the public's perception through false information, misinformation, and all these kind of things. And I think we're seeing some of that in right blatantly in the open now. It's pretty scary. But on the flip side of that, some people argue, well, it's almost it's impossible. How could you disclose if there was some kind of extraterrestrial or other intelligence? How could you possibly disclose that to the world? Number one, because of how intense that is, right? It's just overwhelming information. Number two, because you have to try to explain that they were potentially withholding this information for 80 years or so. So that's two things. But then on the other end, it's if such a thing was real, the potential for opportunity, where we're essentially in a way being held back from a fundamental aspect of reality, where you could have this whole time scientists and academics and others looking at this and benefiting the planet, regarding that. So what do you think of that kind of like contradiction?
So I feel like that there's a number of predisposed assumptions that go into that conclusion, right? Sure. The first big assumption is that you're assuming that because it's been held back from the average person, it's also being held back from academics and scientists. That's not necessarily true. There are plenty of academics and scientists who have very strict NDAs from leading universities to work with the government. So right now, if the government were to come into contact with extraterrestrials or believe that there's non-humanoid life forms out there, or non-human life forms out there. They could tap on any number of researchers, scientists, military generals. They could tap on pretty much anybody and say, hey, we have something interesting for you, but you have to sign this non-disclosure. And if you break the non-disclosure, you're going to jail for the rest of your life, right? They can offer that opportunity to anybody. And that still protects the disclosure. That still protects, leaks from happening. So that is a major flaw in that conclusion, that we're going to be missing out on some opportunity for advancement. For all we know, the reason that we ever invented Twinkies was because 70 years ago, aliens came and some scientists talked to them and found out how to create a permanent, preservative. We have no idea, right? But my point is, it's a false conclusion to think that we're being held back. People who come to that conclusion, what they're actually saying is that they personally feel like they would be held back. And that's not the same thing as saying the human race would be held back. So, I would be much more comfortable knowing that there's a controlled rollout of information pertaining to extraterrestrial life. I would be much more comfortable with that than letting the alternate happen, like you said, where it's mass hysteria because of information overload and people can't handle that information and, mob mentality sets in. That would be a terrible outcome.
Do you think that people would be able to handle that if there was some kind of disclosure like that?
I think people would be able to handle it if it was rolled out the right way. And the right way to me means in a controlled, very slow way, right? Right. I also feel like we're still a developing human race. We're not at our peak development, no matter what we might think.
Yeah, no way.
We're nowhere near our peak yet. So if it takes 30 years before we reach that peak, and then somebody somewhere decides, well, we're grown up enough that we can talk about, these aliens among us. Maybe the ants that we see every day are actually alien life forms and nobody told us.
Yeah.
That would create hysteria. If we said that tomorrow, people would be out there killing every ant that they could find just because they're afraid. But maybe 30 years from now, we'll be able to say, oh, well, you know what? That's a respected individual life form. And maybe I can try to communicate with the ants. Who knows?
Yeah.
But my point is just, I want to see us all advance to a much further place when we can stop arguing about controversies and when we can stop being afraid of whether a president really has an American citizenship or whether he's in the pocket of the Russians or whether he's just, standing in place until the new vice president takes over. Like, it's just ridiculous what people fill their brains with right now. Conspiracies on both sides. We're nowhere near at a place where we deserve or where we've proven as a human race that we can handle widespread full disclosure.
Yeah. And, I just one more question on this aspect would be, some people say, oh, well, if there was some kind of disclosure, and actually Ronald Reagan said this in something like 7 speeches. If we were informed that there's some kind of visiting alien race, extraterrestrials, or again, UFO intelligence, it would kind of unite the world in a way. What do you think of that ideology?
I think that ideologically that sounds like a sound theory, and it would, because now if you consider the world as it is now, there are people that the majority of people have never actually met a Russian or a Chinese. In the United States, only 25% of the entire population has a passport, and only 25% of that population has ever used their passport to go somewhere other than Canada or Mexico. So that means you've got like 85% of all Americans who have never left the United States.
Yeah.
The entire way they think about Iranians, Chinese, Russians, Ecuadorians, right? Some of these Syrians, the way they think about them is negative and hostile because that's the overwhelming information that they get from world news. What's the overwhelming, information they've gotten from sci-fi movies and otherwise, right? Hostile, scary, whatever else.
Yeah.
If there were to be a disclosure that said, hey, there is extraterrestrial life, now all of a sudden, all those Russians, Chinese, and Syrians that we're afraid of aren't the scariest thing. There is something scarier, and that is absolutely a uniting force. Just like when heroes and villains in comic books work together against some greater villain, it would absolutely unite people. I don't think that unification would outweigh the negative effects of what would happen from the same disclosure.
Okay. Very interesting point of view. I don't think I've heard that one yet, so I really appreciate your perspective. Now, again, you got everyday espionage and everyday spy. So in that context, how do you think it would benefit people using that kind of mindset to kind of look at the UFO subject?
When you apply the principles that I teach at everydayspy.com, or even the tactics that I teach people in the Everyday Espionage podcast, when you apply those skills, those systems of thinking into your everyday life, you actually elevate your own mental performance. So you stop being distracted and you start being more focused, and you stop being persuaded against information that is objective fact, and you start feeling confident and comfortable owning your own conclusions. If we lived in a world where everybody individually owned their own conclusions, maximized their critical thinking skills, and owned their own conclusions, our world would be a very different place. Because right now, all of the systems from government and elections to sales are all built on the fact that people are an animal that likes to have a tribal mental connection. We are always looking for people who think like us, act like us, believe what we believe, and then we bond together specifically so that we don't have to engage anybody who thinks differently. So we end up in these pods. The divisiveness in the United States is just a matter of time. That's what happens when people are given more information, more technology to gather and separate. That's what happens, is you have this polar difference between people. So using the skills and the tools that I teach through everydayspy.com and Everyday Espionage, that's the exact same skill set that CIA operators learn so that they can operate undercover in the most dangerous places in the world and never get confused, never get fooled, never get tricked, maintain their own security, maintain their own awareness, maximize the intelligence they're collecting, and then bring it home to keep Americans safe. Everybody could use that in their life to win at work, to win in relationships, to maximize their business earnings. And I've seen it happen for myself, which is why I spend my entire life now dedicated to teaching that to others.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And now just, for the listeners, if you had a message to leave them with, what would that be?
My message would be that if you came here to learn about UFOs, I hope that you are feeling empowered to continue believing that there is something in the sky. Probability dictates that there is something interesting happening in the sky. Absolutely. We just don't have enough information to confirm whether it's something man-made or something not human. But look to the sky and keep your imagination open, keep looking, keep being hungry, keep seeking discovery, but learn a few of the skills that I teach through everydayspy.com so that you don't have to be distracted anymore. Distracted and have your fears stoked and your worries keep you up at night because of some wild theory that somebody created out of thin air that has no basis in fact. Factual information and factual understanding is the future. It is the thing that's going to evolve us to the point where a massive disclosure is going to be a welcome thing. And as long as we keep leaning on our own fears and our own suspicions that are not based in fact, we're always going to be stunted in our growth as a human race.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Andrew. All the links are going to be in the description to Andrew's work. And again, I really appreciate you coming out of your way to come on this podcast. UFOs, the stigma is dropping, but I appreciate you coming on and doing this.
It's my pleasure, man. Take care, and thanks for having me, James.
You too, brother.